Okay, here are my peoples to watch the speech. Steak. One of Americans' favorite meals is also one of the easiest to cook and the easiest to mess up. How many times have you made a steak only to cut it open and it's still raw, or worse yet, gray inside? Today I'm going to teach you how to choose, prepare, and serve a great steak every time. We'll be starting with how to choose the right steak. Depending on what dish you're serving, you'd like to present it. There are two categories of steak to choose from. There are lean steaks like skirt, flank, and flat iron, which are very cheap and very flavorful meat cuts and require a bit of work ahead of time, and fatty steaks like ribeye, T-bone, and porterhouse, which are very easy steaks to prepare and require very little. Lean steaks are great for sliced steaks, fajitas, sandwiches, or small plates. They contain many tough tendons and ligaments and will first need to be cleaned off, including a layer of tissue called silver skin. All of these, when cooked, shrink and get tough and are not fun to eat. This extra work is why they cost less, but the meat from these steaks are from vessels that work the most and are therefore very flavorful and worth the extra effort. The cooking method for these kinds of steaks need to be prolonged in order to break down any tough areas and tenderize them. Braising, slow roasting are typical, but you can grill them as well as long as you pre-tenderize them. What do we mean by that? There are many ways to pre-tenderize tough meats. You can marinate them with herbs, oil, and vinegar. This takes about 30 minutes to an hour. You can brine them in salt and vinegar and spices overnight, or you can pound it with a meat tenderizer. I really wouldn't recommend the latter method unless you're going to stuff or roll a steak. Marinades and salts break down the proteins in steak that tighten when cooked. Fattier steaks are best for entree meals, served as a whole piece. They don't contain many, if any, of the tough tendons, and should have a nice marbling of fat throughout the steak for fuller flavor. The fat, when cooked, melts out of the steak, making it juicy and sizzly. You may, however, want to trim fat off the sides of the steak in order to get a good sear. The cooking method for these kinds of steaks are grilling, oven roasting, or pan searing. Preparing these cuts can be simple, as letting them sit out at room temperature, freezing them to get the top layer frozen. I prefer a spice rub of your own choosing, rubbed all over the steak before serving. Now for the cooking. The most important part of all dry heat methods is for the sear. Searing food by applying it to very hot heat causes what's called a Maillard reaction. This is what happens when proteins brown and get crispy. This gives the item a golden brown color, a crispy crunch, and releases tons of flavor. However, if you keep it too long on that intense heat, it will burn. So how do we get around that? There are a couple ways. Firstly, this works great for both lean and fat steaks. You can sear the outside of the steak, including the sides, if it's a thick steak, until desired brownness. Then place the steak in the oven and continue cooking the inside till it reaches the desired temperature. 140 for rare, 145 for medium rare, 150 for medium, and this will increase about 5 degrees while resting. This method works for grilling as well if you have hot charcoal. It can be tough to regulate, but you can either place it over a grill after the marks are achieved, or move all the coals to one side of the grill and the steak on the other side, and it will slow cook after the sear. The braising method for leaner steaks starts also with a sear, but then the steak is placed almost covered in liquid, usually stock or wine, and then cooked slowly until the meat falls apart. This isn't the preferred way to cook fattier steaks. I've recently heard of a technique for deep frying steak. That's right, but it's not what you think. First, you'll cook the steak to 10 degrees colder than you like it, remove it, and then submerge it in hot oil. What does this do? It gives a crisp Maillard reaction and seals in moisture. Try it, you have to taste it to believe it. Finally, the last stage of the cook is resting. You might point out that this isn't cooking, but you'd be wrong. When you take something off the heat, there is residual heat called carryover cooking. This plays a factor not only in the temperature before cutting, the temperature of the meat, but is also in the moisture. This is why a steak must be pulled out before it is done and set to rest off before cutting. As you can see by my aid, the longer you let the meat rest, the more moist it stays. Why does this happen? The cooking proteins, when cooking proteins, the cell structure tightens, pushing liquid away from the heat and out of the cells. If you were to cut a steak immediately, the water has nowhere to go but on your plate. However, the longer steak sits, the proteins relax, allowing water back into the meat, and that's where it stays when you cut it. Speaking of cutting, the final step is serving. Should you serve it whole or slice it for your guests, it is fattier. If it is fattier, steak people would typically expect whole, and if it's leaner, then it is usually sliced and placed over a vegetable or a starch. Just remember to let it rest first, because if a sliced steak can leak and dry out quickly. So now that you know how to choose the right steak, lean or fatty, prepare a marinade and brine it, cook it, grilling it, and roasting it, serve it after it is rested, and it's time for a dinner party. So now that you know how to choose the right steak, prepare it, and serve it, it's time for a dinner party.